amazing pastor. You already know that, right? That Pastor Lawrence is incredible. And, I'm so glad that he is guiding you and had the foresight to bring you all into the fold of the Action Project. I am celebrating his leadership, and I'm celebrating your courage today as we're beginning and embarking on this journey. Pastor Lawrence is right. It's great to mute for a couple of reasons. One of them is because he is recording, because there are several of members of your team that are not able to attend. And so, me being a mother of 5, I know what that's like to have kids and background noise and animals and all the things. And so to keep the quality of the recording, it's good to mute. Also, I'll be doing a fair amount of sharing of my video screen, which means I won't see all of your lovely faces. And so if you do have questions or raise your hand even, I may not see that. So I'm actually going to ask Pastor Lawrence to be my wing person and to kind of take a look and see. So if you have questions or things and you raise your hand, he'll be able to see and will let me know so that we can pause and move forward. So I want to begin our time the same way I did before with a land acknowledgement and an opening prayer, just to center ourselves. And then we're going to get started because we have a lot of really great conversations to make our way through today. So let's begin with our land acknowledgement. As we gather today, we acknowledge the sacred land on which we stand and sit and pray. We remember that before the sidewalks and the roads and the bridges that led us here, this land was an oak savanna. Indigenous peoples walked and lived on this sacred land, and it holds both pain and beauty for Indigenous peoples today, and indeed for all of us. Today, we honor all of the Indigenous peoples of this territory, recognizing that many are from tribes which were never formally recognized by the federal government. Let us be grateful to have the opportunity to live and to work and to worship and to thrive in this sacred space. Let us pray together today. Good and gracious God, I thank you so much for the leadership of Pastor Lawrence and for the courage of this team, of this scrappy team who are coming together to learn more about you and about you in themselves and in other people. God, give them the courage to lean in, to open their hearts and their ears, to listen in new and creative and innovative ways, God. Help us to celebrate you and each other. Help us to draw in closer to you as we hear and embark on this hard and this beautiful and this sacred journey. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, so I'm going to get ready to share my screen, but just before I do, this is the first thing I want to do is invite you to unmute and to share maybe a couple of reflections about what it was like to take the IDI. What are some of your reflections about this assessment?
Well, I've taken the IDI before at Blake School. I can't remember how many years ago, but I did notice there were some new technology related questions. And I also caught myself in this weird position of like, no, that was the wrong answer last time. You better change your answer this time. And I thought, well, is that cheating or is that because I now have a different understanding? So that was just kind of a funny piece for me.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. Thank you for sharing. We tend to wonder, not even what is the right answer, but oh my gosh, what's the best answer if there is one? And that can definitely be a challenge as we're taking this assessment. Because there is no right or best answer, right?
Right.
There is none of those.
Yeah.
Someone else, how was it for you to take this IDI?
Mm-hmm. I'd say the same. Like, I wasn't saying, I was like questioning myself, like, oh, like, I don't know if that's the answer I should put, but I'm like, but I was like, I'm gonna just be honest and put what I feel the most, you know? So I was like trying to be honest with myself while I took it. But you did find yourself questioning yourself a bit, you know?
I think the what I've noticed most is I kept looking for an I don't know response, like unknown. Like the questions that would ask, you know, is another culture more whatever than your culture? I don't know. And I kept thinking, where's the button to select? I don't know. So that was tricky for me, I thought.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. No way out. There's no way out. One more.
I had the same problem. And in fact, the other thing that happened with me, I think, was when it asked you to react to a question about another culture. My sense of who that other culture was kept shifting. You know, what other culture am I thinking about? That's why I wanted to say I don't know a lot too, because I didn't know what culture I was talking about that might be other than mine.
Interesting.
I felt the same. I actually like, I answered, like, I remember one of the first 5 questions one way, and then when I got like 15, 16 questions in and asked another question, I'm like, my answer to this one feels contradictory a little bit to the one of the earlier ones I took, you know?
Yeah.
Some of the questions and my answers to them made me a little sad, because I realized how scanty my own culture is, and that I don't really know what is my culture as an older white woman of, you know, the Northern Europe and Eastern European background. What is my culture?
It definitely invokes some thought, right? These are thought-provoking questions. And I remember initially being told when I first took the IDI, oh, you'll take it in 30 minutes. And I thought, oh, you don't know what happens in my brain. It takes me a lot longer because there were so many possibilities and angles, right? And the challenging thing is I was intentionally vague with you in that first information session, right? I mean, I intentionally didn't tell you what to expect. I didn't tell you what you could anticipate. I didn't tell you what the options might be. And I wanted to keep it that way because I didn't want to influence the way that you took the assessment. I wanted you to go in the best way that you could. And again, this is so countercultural to us, to our society, where there is a right and a wrong way of doing things, to go in and say that there could be a range. Remember, the IDI is an assessment that really is not about right or wrong answers. It's about understanding how you view the world and how you engage with people that have similar or have different cultural backgrounds, whatever that word means, that's culture. And there isn't any right or wrong way about that, right? There's no right or wrong answer because we each are different individuals, and each of us have a unique way of viewing the world. So there is no right or wrong answer. There's just information, right? So I kind of take it as a little bit of an experiment, kind of going through and moving forward, knowing that we don't have those options, and kind of the measuring, the evaluation scales are a bit different. So I'm going to share my screen because I want to kind of go through some things with you. And remember, if you have questions or thoughts, I'm asking Pastor Lawrence to be my wing person so he can see you, because I can only see just a couple of you as I'm sharing my screen. So I want to remind you that part of this, even in this conversation, is that, culture is one of those buzzwords that we talked about that tends to get overused and, kind of contorted, and we rearrange it and tie it up and reshape it. But culture is usually learned. What culture is and how we use it is learned. We've learned that it's also shared. And that it's largely unspoken. So we learn about the rules and the banks of the river. We learn about how we describe culture. Even the words that we use to describe them are words and buzzwords that we pick up from other spaces, from our family settings or from our work settings or our worship spaces. We learn about what it means to have culture and to share culture from all of these places that contribute to our perceptions of the world. And if you remember, I'm going to skip, but I'll come back to that screen in a second. This is my kind of a bigger image of the iceberg that I showed you in the information session. In the information session, this was the iceberg image that I had showed to you before. growing up, I'd seen this image and had never seen it, you know, in relation to conversations about diversity and intercultural competence. And so seeing it now, it is such a, it's a widely used image because it talks about the fact that what we see at the top, what we see at face value is at the tip of the iceberg, that's above the surface, right? And so these are things that we may see either just seeing someone or having an initial conversation with someone, but also these are things that don't really delve deeper into the core aspects of what makes us who we are, right? What defines our values and our roles. And so when we're talking about that buzzword of culture and what it is, all of this above and below the surface is culture, right? Culture is our roles and our values, what we believe, what we don't believe, what we like. All of this makes up culture. And so look at this. So this picture here is a little bit different from that initial iceberg picture because it kind of puts these words to it. And it's so much more because at the bottom it says, and so on. But there's more than 60 examples of things that help to make up and shape our culture. So I want to invite you to look at this really quickly and let's call out, invite a couple people to call out what you see that kind of leaps off the page at you. What do you see that's interesting about culture here?
Concept of justice.
Ah, concept of justice. We're all unique with our own understandings. And so not everybody has the same concept of justice. Yes. And someone else.
Attitudes versus elders. Attitudes towards elders.
Oh, now that's a big one, right? That's a big one. In different cultures have different ways that elders are revered and that they are cared for, right? Absolutely. One more.
Ideas of child rearing.
I had to kind of give the look on that, right? That's always a conversation is about, people have different ideas of how children should be raised. And there is no, again, this all is about, a lot of these things that you see here are things that we've learned from our own parents, right? We've learned from our own parents and our own family systems about ways that we raise children, ways that we connect with elders. We learn a whole lot about concepts of beauty or body language or, discussions about attitudes toward dependence or, roles in relation to age and sex and class. All these things that shape us, we learn from other spaces. And this is what that image meant was unmute. There we go. And so these are things that all shape our perception. And what's interesting is that for us as human beings, all of us, it's important for us to understand that not everyone views the world the same way. It can be really challenging and cause quite a bit of conflict if we have that expectation that people will approach the world and approach matters of injustice or matters of raising children, matters of handling emotion in the same way. That just kind of creates the opportunity for a whole lot of miscommunication, right? And so I found this fun commercial that I want to show you because it really speaks to this.
The English believe it's a slur on your host's food if you don't clear your plate. Whereas the Chinese feel you're questioning their generosity if you do. At HSBC, we never underestimate the importance of local knowledge. Which is why we have local banks staffed by local people in over 80 countries across the globe. HSBC, the world's local bank.
What'd you think of that? That's one of my favorite commercials ever. You love that? I'm so angry that that bank is here. I wish the bank was here. They'd have a whole bunch of new members. You know, about 4 years ago, this bank created a capital campaign of a variety of commercials, all surrounding diversity, that I think is so interesting and so timely, right? This is exactly what we're talking about, is that we have these ideas that everyone sees the world that we do, and we don't. We have so many different understandings of how the world works and how relationships are supposed to thrive. And this is kind of a wake-up call for us to say, oh, no, that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? But there are so many other ways and ideas that we have about how we and others should be moving about in the world. So I'm going to share my screen again here. Exit full screen. I don't want to do that. There we go. And so this kind of brings it right back to that same, brings it right on back home to that. So I'm not going to say anything. I think this image speaks for itself first. So I want to invite you to look at this image. And then let's talk about what you notice.
There are a lot of Western countries on the left.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What else are you noticing?
Well, it just looks like, as she said, non-Western countries seem to take longer to build up trust. Like they're more relationship based and less casual about trusting. It's interesting.
There's also a comment in the chat that says that the left is very Eurocentric.
Any other thoughts?
There's another comment in the chat that says there are no Latin American countries.
Well, I'm seeing a couple. I'm seeing a couple that are here.
The relationship-based cultures are more methodical.
I'm seeing some South American countries. I see Peru, right? I see,
Yeah.
I see Chile. There
I'm
are
also-
so many countries in the world. I would assume that we probably would need a whole bunch of screens to get them all on one image, right?
From what I see, the countries that are on the right that are categorized as more relational versus the ones that are on the left are categorized as more transactional.
That's right. Right. So this is kind of just a snapshot. So again, if we had an image, there's definitely not, there are so many countries that are not on this snapshot at all. I think this is meant just to give an example of, to support this idea, this theory, that this is an image that's talking about two different types of cultures, that we don't live in a monocultural world. We don't live in a world where there's one culture and where everyone identifies and values relationships in the same way, or it values connection in the same way. And so this image is kind of giving that. And so the word trusting in the middle is kind of talking about where we place our trust, where we place our value. And so when I think about how we live in the USA, this totally resonates with me, that we tend to put a lot of trust and a lot of weight on people and organizations who are able to get things done, to get them done quickly. where there's a value toward transactional, checklist, to-do lists. I think about all of the images that pop up on my Facebook news feed that tell me I need to be more efficient, that want me to get more journals and more checklists and more virtual assistants. And this is the way that this is what we as a whole, so this is not individual people, this is kind of as a whole, that there tends to be more value on a task-based focus versus another type of a culture here. We're just looking at two, so there are a variety of cultures, right? But just two, where there tends to be a value more on relationship in other spaces. So 3 years ago, I traveled from the US to Ghana. I did an accompaniment tour with the ELCA Global Missions. And I can tell you that even there in traveling, this was definitely a culture shock for me. Me who has, 4 different ways of telling time literally on my body right now as I'm talking to you, who is constantly, checking calendars and Googling and really focused on getting things done. This was it was a culture shock to be in a space where clocks were not easily and readily accessible on tops of buildings, where it was more value on relationship and on attending to other people. It was about experience versus more about kind of a destination or a task list. And so this is kind of naming that, which I think is really important, because if we are living in a space that values more of the task base. If we live in the United States as more of a microwave, get it done, rush, rush, rush type of society, and this is where we live, and we connect with people who have a different idea of what it means to connect, what could happen?
We can breathe.
Hmm. I think it could also present some possibilities of conflict, right? There could be some misunderstandings if we're in spaces where we view the world very differently, right? I'm going to show you something else. I'll come back to that one. So as we're talking about conflict, this quadrant model that is used by a lot of scholars, and then is also has been adopted and is used often with the intercultural development inventory. This is an intercultural conflict style. So there are 4 different quadrants of how people tend to respond and navigate conflict. You'll see that there is more of a direct discussion style. You'll see that that's in the upper left quadrant. The lower left quadrant is more accommodation, where there's an emotional restraint and more indirect. Some people would probably place Minnesota Nice in that quadrant. You'll see the bottom right is more of a dynamic emotional expressiveness. And then there's also the engagement style that's up above, which is kind of free to engage and to share feelings and emotions, to be very open about feelings and emotions. What are you noticing?
I'm looking at the bottom left, the accommodation style. And I know when we were in Korea many years ago, we were told that no one in Korea will tell you no. Like if you say, I need an extra pillow in my hotel room, they'll say yes, and then it may never arrive, but they're not going to say, oh, we can't do that, or we don't have one. They're just going to say, sure, I'm on it. And so it was just an interesting cultural piece to me.
Yeah. And again, this is not individuals. This isn't every single person, right? That may not be every single person where you visited, but this is kind of a tendency, and this is important for us to know, right? When I think about, where we are, and me, for example, who I grew up Baptist, but I also have spent some time, I have ELCA roots. And there's a joke that comes around in the Lutheran church of the frozen chosen, of people who are very stoic in face and in posture sometimes, and the feeling that is a way of engaging. This is important. Why is this model? Why am I showing you this? Why do you think this is important for our conversation?
Well, I'm thinking of a colleague and friend of mine who, in my opinion, struggled with a lot of this and would interpret people as being rude. And I would say, I don't think they're rude. I think they're just, they're from, New York City. Or one day she came to me and she said, I asked so-and-so how he was and he told me. It's like, yeah, because how are you doesn't always just mean hello in every culture. And so I think, and as a teacher for many years, I know I got into many arguments or disagreements with colleagues over families. And it was me saying, I think that's their culture. I think that's, they're not over the top. If you were in, in like Japan or Korea, this parent, I don't know for sure, but what I've learned, I don't think this parent's behavior would be considered over the top. It would be considered responsible parenting, or I don't think this parent means to come in and be rude. It's just they have a very direct style that's in conflict with Minnesota nice, so yeah, I think it's
that's well said. Yeah, that's well said. I think that, for us in ministry, this is important information. It's important because as we're navigating, any healthy relationship has conflict. Every single relationship has conflict, whether it's a romantic relationship or a ministry relationship or a professional relationship. There is always going to be some conflict. That's healthy. It's important for us to know that we all don't, just like we don't view the world or eels the same way, we also don't necessarily view conflict the same way and navigate conflict the same way. And this is important for us to recognize and to make room for the fact that, so those are things that we wouldn't necessarily see at face value, right? We wouldn't have any idea about people's discussion style or beliefs. We would have no idea how conflict is navigated. But this is important for us to be mindful of as we're thinking about things like organizational structures and how we are, some of our protocols and policies and things that we're putting in place, wanting to make sure that they have room for the fact that people may view the world and engagement in a variety of different ways. But if we didn't know this and so I'll tell you, for me, I have family meetings at home with my kids. And it isn't just me. I have 5 kids, ages 13 to 24. And as long as they've been able to talk, anybody can call a family meeting. So my son, when he was 8, could call a family meeting where we'd all have to get up and go to the living room and have a conversation. So we're very discussion focused. This is us. We're very discussion focused. You can imagine how them, as talkative and communicative as they are, how that could be challenging in other spaces when they move into spaces where people may not be as communication heavy or may not navigate conflict in that way. There could be misunderstandings. We could possibly think that someone who's communicating as a child could be considered mouthy, or it could be considered disrespectful. These are things that we may view, right? And so it takes kind of getting beneath the surface for us to understand these things. And all of this is really guiding us toward the hope toward intercultural competence. We're hoping to gain the capability to shift cultural perspective and adapt or bridge our behavior toward cultural commonality and difference. Shortly stated, we're hoping to learn how to figure out how to do life together. That's our goal. So with all of this in mind, I want to make sure I check in with you before we move into the IDI report. Are there any questions about what I've shared at all so far?
Yeah, I see Molly has her hand up. Hi, Molly, and hi, Clarence. I'm going to ask you to unmute because you are muted. And then I see Dave also signaling that, oh no, Dave is saying hello, right? Okay, yes.
Yeah,
All right.
okay. My question is, could you explain on that last chart, dynamic a little bit more?
Yeah, so people who are dynamic, you'll find that there may be more expression. The difference kind of between being having a stoic presentation versus someone who may be communicating and expressing with a lot of energy and a lot of emotion. So this would be a communication style. So if there's a concern, or if the children are bickering, they may be very, very expressive, very communicative, and willing to share their emotions with whoever they're connecting with. And that would be kind of in contrast to someone who may be much more stoic and who may not be sharing feelings, who may be discussing and sharing their emotions, but may not necessarily share their feelings as much. So you may not know they're upset. I'm trying to think of an example of conflict where someone may, you may notice they may have a very, the posture may be, poised and still and very calm and communicating like this, like I would be doing. And maybe I could be raging on the inside, but I may share with you my feelings in this way. And a lot of times in corporate spaces and professional spaces, this is what's appropriate. It's kind of considered appropriate that this is how I share my feelings with you. If I'm mad, if I'm upset, if I'm frustrated, I share it in this way. Versus someone who may be sharing their emotions, you would know, maybe my facial expressions would show. If I'm engaging, my facial expressions would show. You would know that I'm upset probably before I even open my mouth. And I would be open, I would be sharing and expressing my feelings and my emotions with you so my entire demeanor, my communication, my body language, my facial expression, all of that would communicate whatever my emotions are.
Interesting. I mean, I just don't associate that much with the Middle Eastern culture. I don't associate that characteristic that much. So interesting.
That's fair. And again, it isn't every single person, right?
No.
That would be a gross overgeneralization. But I think that this is a characteristic that that some scholars and some folks have found in some of those spaces. And it may be more of a regional space and not necessarily a particular area or particular group or people, but just kind of a regional space, right? I looked at that chart with the quadrants and I right away said, oh my gosh, I can see where Minnesota would fall. I said right away, I could see where Minnesota would fall on this map, right?
Yeah.
There are oftentimes when people assume that I'm a transplant because my communication style is very different from what people may be accustomed to.
Pastor Gia, I also want to bring up that there's a comment in the chat box from Nora who says, and so there's often judgmentalness of others that results, which is communicated through voice, tone, body language, etc.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. Very much so. And a lot of that is us us not being aware, right? We expect that everyone views the world the same way that we do. And that there's one way to navigate or one right way to navigate conflict. And we'll talk more about this as we peel back the layers of the results of the feedback report. But a lot of times this is what happens. But the world is big and vast and diverse in such a variety of different ways. And so these examples are just two of so many, right? If you think about all of those that were beneath the surface of that iceberg. These are just two a variety of ways where there could definitely be some confusion and some misunderstanding, right? And opportunities for some judgment to happen. And when we kind of go deeper, we can see why, as we begin to think about these things and the wheels turn, we could think about organizationally, there are some structures which probably may be created, some systems that may be created to support one particular way of navigating conflict, which could be problematic or challenging for people who culturally may not navigate conflict in that way. For example, maybe if there's conflict between two people, oftentimes a mediator is one of the ways that people bring someone in to navigate conflict. But for people who may be coming from spaces, let's say where women, there are some cultures where women are not encouraged to speak up, or there may be some spaces where people are not comfortable openly connecting. They'd rather, communicate privately or communicate via email or something like that. This could be challenging and the outcome may not be what we hope for. And so oftentimes we create systems, we create policies based upon what serves us well, whoever the us is. We create those systems with us in mind. And so this is just kind of wanting to kind of begin to talk about, this is an example of what intercultural competence and development looks like, is begin to widen that, to consider policies and systems and protocols that make room for people that are coming from a variety of different spaces. So when we ask questions like, I wonder why our ministries are not more diverse ethnically. When we ask questions about, we wonder why there are certain spaces that may lack diversity. These are some of the reasons why they might be. If people don't find themselves or find room for them in the spaces in which they've been designed.
Pastor Jia, I want to say this brings up an example from the book Waking Up White, the first book that some of us are reading in our small groups. The author, Debbie Allen, before her current work, she was a teacher. And it's the same thing of, there was this student that she saw as disrespectful because she'd get up and go over to other students' desks all the time. And she's thinking, how can I get this girl to sit still? And so she's developing all of these things to, reward her sitting still, and finds out that the girl was sensing that other students were having problems understanding the work, and she was helping those students with their math problems. And once the teacher figured that out, then it was like, oh, so then she can work with her and say, well, during the part where I start talking, then you can stay seated. But as soon as I'm done, then you can, but work with the student, as opposed to the however many months before that, thinking that this student is just being disruptive and that she's just not, getting it, or whatever the case may be. And then of course the student's feeling misunderstood and then doesn't apply herself to the work because now she's feeling defeated and she can't communicate, or maybe she doesn't have the words to communicate what she's really doing. And it's all cultural differences.
Absolutely.
Well,
Absolutely.
That's reminding me of I think it was just a tape actually that we listened to years ago when I was in ed school, and it was the person talking, or the professor that we were watching was I believe was Latino, and he was talking about the tone, like pitch and tone, like how much inflection you have in your voice and stuff like that, and watching Spanish-speaking kids in the classroom, and particularly Spanish-speaking males, and particularly Mexican-American males, I believe. And in at least back then, men talk in a monotone. So these guys were always hearing from the teacher, no, put more emotion into it, not realizing that was like asking them to talk like a girl. And also that because of that, they often thought the teacher was yelling at them. And they interpreted that as the teacher only yells at the Hispanic kids, when in fact the teacher was using a tone of voice that she would not have considered to be yelling. But to them, if you use that tone, and it just was like, oh, this is so complex. But it was fascinating to me.
Yeah, that's a wonderful example. Tone of voice, wonderful example. Of how we can completely confuse intent just by not being aware. And we can also confuse emotional levels. Are we angry? Are we excited? Are we just animated? What's happening? And then when we tend to punish people, right, we send a message. That's kind of that whole thing I shared with that video or with that slide that says that culture is usually learned and shared, right? Is because when people begin to, when we punish people or we set people apart and because they're not responding in the way that we feel is appropriate, then we teach them what culture is. We teach them by doing these things, what is appropriate or what is not appropriate. Even if we don't sit down and say, in this culture, we don't yell, or in this culture, we sit still when someone's talking. When we teach them these things, we're teaching people about expectations and about culture and about what we believe are the norms. And so that's how it becomes learned and shared. And oftentimes when that happens, there's kind of an expectation that whoever the person is on the receiving end will lessen themselves and will begin to assimilate to become a part of the new culture, right? And that's where the challenges become, because people begin to lose parts of who they are or their identity in order to morph and become a part of the acceptable culture that's around them. So I'm looking at the time, it's 2:45. I'm ready to move into the IDI report, but I'm also aware that we have a 2 hour, that we still have more time to go. So I want to be mindful in case people need like a 2 or 3 minute bio break. Do we need that, or are we ready to keep going? We're ready to keep going? Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen and we're gonna plug right away. All right. So just a quick reminder that when you took the IDI, this is the intercultural development continuum. So each of us individually, and then you as a group collectively, when you took your assessment, you've each landed somewhere on this continuum. From left to right, no political affiliation, you will see that there is denial, there is polarization, there's minimization, there's acceptance, and adaptation. The two on the left, denial and polarization, tend to be more of that monocultural environment, that mindset where there's just one way of doing things, and we need to get on the bandwagon. There's one way. And then there's there's the minimization, is that bridger piece. And then we move into more of the intercultural mindsets, which is more of the embracing and appreciation of the values that are present in different cultures around us. These are just a reminder of the orientation description. So denial is the orientation that recognizes more observable cultural differences like food, but may not notice deeper cultural differences like those conflict resolution styles that I shared with you, and may avoid or withdraw from such differences. Polarization is known as the judgmental orientation because it views cultural differences in terms of an us versus them. You'll see that it'll be one of two ways. There'll be the defense polarization, which has an uncritical view, usually a more uncritical view toward one's own cultural values and practices, but that will be coupled with an overly critical view of another culture. And then reverse would be the opposite, having a really critical view of one's own culture, but have an uncritical view about other cultures. Minimization is that bridging one I talked about. It's an orientation that highlights cultural commonality, like the shared humanity and universal values and principles, but they may also mask deeper recognition and appreciation of cultural differences. Moving into the intercultural mindset, acceptance is an orientation that recognizes and appreciates patterns of cultural difference and commonality in one's own and in other cultures. And then there's adaptation. This orientation can shift cultural perspective and change behavior in culturally appropriate and authentic ways. So that may be thinking about that conflict resolution, right? That may be me being a discussion style focus, me having that discussion style focus of conflict. I may move into spaces and recognize that some spaces may have a different conflict style, and I would be able to adapt to that type of conflict style. All right. So this is kind of like giving you that quick snapshot of the differences there, of the kind of the buzzwords. Denial is missing difference. Polarization is judging difference. Minimization is de-emphasizing difference. Acceptance is deeply comprehending difference. And adaptation is bridging across difference. All right. So this is your perceived orientation reflects where your group places itself on the continuum. So this reflects how the group sees itself when interacting with cultural diverse individuals and groups. They could be anywhere on the spectrum at all. And this is really important because this really communicates how effective you believe you are in engaging with individuals and groups that are culturally diverse. That's important because this is kind of how the space and where you're operating. And this is where your group has landed. So your group as a whole, those of you who took who all took this particular IDI in this cohort, that you perceive that you are in a space of acceptance where you are deeply comprehending difference. You recognize and appreciate patterns of cultural difference and commonality in your own and in other cultures. So this is kind of how you feel, the level of effectiveness that you feel that you have. Developmental orientation indicates your primary orientation toward cultural differences. So this is kind of assessed by the IDI where your group actually has placed. It's a perspective that your group most likely uses in these situations where cultural differences and commonalities need to be bridged, right? This is where this kind of your default, if you can imagine your default, this is your default. And it could be anywhere on that spectrum. It could be denial, polarization, minimization, acceptance, or adaptation. And so as a whole, your group landed right in minimization. This is the one that the orientation that highlights cultural commonalities, universal values and principles, but may also mask deeper recognition and appreciation of cultural differences. So I'm going to pause this here and let's talk about it. How are you feeling in hearing this news? Does that surprise you or does it resonate?
Well, I would say before we got where we are at the political result currently, I would say that it would be very difficult to agree with this evaluation. Simply because of, because of the challenges, irregardless of the side that you were on politically, we determined we were right and the other people need to just go away.
To me, the minimization is a it just seems really Minnesotan. Like, of course, that's where we are, because to move into acceptance and adaptation, you have to risk offending people, and you probably will offend people, and then you have to learn from that, and then you have to not get your feelings hurt, and then you might have to have conflict and conversations. And so if you just show up and assume that we're all going to get along and we're all going to understand each other, that's kind of a Minnesotan attitude, I think.
Culture.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
And
I'm not
everyone like they take energy to do too. Minnesota be like, oh, we could do that, but maybe tomorrow.
exactly. And from Minnesota, I've been here for been in Minnesota for 30 years, so I'm probably pretty much from Minnesota, but that sort of playing things down to the extent that it happens in Minnesota was a surprising cultural piece to me. And I moved to Minnesota from the West Coast, and I don't consider I'm like a major, let's smooth things over. Ooh, don't yell. I don't want to have an argument. But just some of the things I saw and heard when I first moved here, I was like, oh, wow, you're even more extreme than me.
I think
let's
I might
talk
have to have you talk a little bit more about that second graphic that you showed. I don't believe I'm understanding.
Which second graphic?
The minimization.
Yep, let's talk about it. So minimization is one of these that focuses on the common humanity, that we're all people, we all have blood pumping in our veins, that we that at the underneath different skin color, different hair types, and different opinions, it focuses on the shared humanity. So let's delve into that. It totally
so then we tend to minimize actual differences.
Minimizing differences. Yes.
Yeah.
So
I understand.
with the IDI, 68% of faith communities land in minimization. This makes a lot of sense. A key aspect, I think, of the way that we share the gospel, the approach we have in sharing the gospel, is in focusing on the shared humanity of every individual. We focus on the fact that Jesus loves us all, that God has created us all, that God has fearfully and wonderfully and designed us all. We focus on this. It's a cornerstone of our ministries. So it makes sense that this would be a space where faith communities tend to hover and resonate. When we think back to responses to injustice, particularly in educational systems, one of the ways that they have continued to thrive has been responding to injustice with the same approach. Teachers have focused on treating every child the same, have focused on communication being the same. This idea of the shared and this kind of common humanity where everyone is the same has been a reproach and a response to injustice for over 2 decades, right? Where we talk about we don't see color and we don't see race and we focus on the person and we treat every person the same. And from this perspective, it makes sense that this is where we would land. And what we're talking about, the distinction that needs to be made here is a difference between, the difference is what we do with those differences. Do we ignore the differences or do we celebrate the differences, right? What we're talking about is the fact that harm can come when we ignore differences. Even if we even not in intending to do that, harm happens when we ignore the differences, right? Versus celebrating them. So it's how we treat those distinctions that we're talking about here. So I'm going to share my screen and let's talk a little bit more about it, okay? All right. So I pulled this up here, again, just as we're talking about faith communities and not just Christianity, right? Here's a Dalai Lama who's talking about always embracing the common humanity that lies at the heart of us all. And we should definitely do that. There's no disagreement with that, right? We're talking about what happens and how we navigate those differences. This is what I call a 12 o'clock chart, just because it helps me so that you can follow along with me. These are some characteristics of folks who land in the orientation of minimization. So starting right at 1 o'clock, let's go through these. People who land in this orientation seek to avoid stereotyping and biased behavior by treating each person as an individual. They'd be interested in differences like customs, but may have limited ability to adapt to other cultural practices. Groups who land in this orientation would recognize the essential humanity of every single person and try to act in tolerant ways, but they may not be fully aware of how one's ideas and behaviors are culturally grounded. So think back to the eel, that commercial, or think back to the conflict resolution styles, right? That the way that people engage may be culturally grounded, and knowing that could affect the way that we view and understand communication and conversation. Groups who land in a minimization orientation tend to assume that people from other cultures are basically like us. And therefore they apply their own cultural values to other cultures in ways that tend to minimize the importance of cultural differences. I'm going to repeat that because that was a whole lot. So folks who land in this orientation tend to assume that people from other cultures are basically like us and apply one's own cultural views to other cultures in ways that minimize the importance of cultural differences. And this could potentially be used as a coping strategy by members of non-dominant cultures, right? So, and let's talk about that. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then finally, they do not view differences as a threat to one's own cultural practices. What we'll see is in this, we'll see this. I found this image. This is minimization kind of gone too far. When we say that we don't see race, when we don't see difference, we don't see distinction, this is when you can see that this is an unhealthy form of minimization. And people who identify as members of the dominant culture would be, this would be dominant minimization. So if you identify as someone who's a member of a dominant culture, you may not even recognize that this is something that is happening. You may not even recognize that this is a system that you're navigating in, right? Just like fish do not know that they're in water. But here's a really great way to look at it. And the golden rule that we know is to treat others treat others how you want to be treated. And here's now an updated platinum rule that says, oh, no, we should treat people how they want to be treated. When we treat people how we want to be treated, it centers us and our experience and our understanding of fair treatment, good treatment, quality treatment. When we treat others how they want to be treated, then it centers their experience and how they would identify and define good, proper, healthy, powerful treatment. So I want to give you some time, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm actually thinking that what I was going to do, we have a small enough group though, but what I was going to do is I would love for you to take some time, and I'm going to ask Pastor Lawrence to help me do this. I didn't even tell him that we were going to do this because usually I'm leading the Zoom room, and so I usually do it on my own. So I'm going to ask for his help. But usually what I'd like to do is to break you into groups. So there are 12 of you without me. So I'd love you to break into groups of 3. So 4 groups of 3. And I'd love for you to begin to think about how minimization has served you well and how it has failed you. Ooh, and before you do that, let's talk about this non-dominant culture thing, because I think that's important. I want to touch on that. I said before that in that kind of the 11 o'clock hour on that chart, that members of the non-dominant culture may use minimization as a coping strategy. So remember when I talked about the fact that the system could be designed in a way, right? When we talked about conflict, I talked about how protocols and practices and policies may be constructed with one particular culture in mind, right? Like the dominant culture may have the way that engagement happens, the way that conflict happens, expectations, the way communication styles are maneuvered, tend to happen in ways that are constructed with the dominant culture in mind. So people who identify as members of a non-dominant culture may be coming into spaces like this and may have to adapt. They may have to minimize, they may feel like it is important for them to minimize their cultural distinctions and differences in order to be embraced, in order to get along in that system. So you may find that some of their coping strategies, some of the communication styles, some of the dress codes, some of the tonation of voice, whatever those things may not be as prevalent or as noticeable, because in order to be able to be embraced, those things may have to be dampened, may have to be hampered a bit and minimized in order for them to be able to get along. Does that make sense? This is very common, particularly for people who are immigrating from other countries and for people of color who are here. This is very common for them to have to navigate in those things, and it totally makes sense when we think about things like yes. It could also be known as code switching. So you think about what's happening in our systems right now. And we're thinking about all of the ways that conversations and communications are happening. It's important for people to understand what's at stake and how to maneuver those things. If we think about what could happen if they don't, right? Oftentimes minimization is the go-to in order to be embraced and to get along. Any other questions about that before we separate? Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask again about the configurations of the room. Are you in a room or not?
I'm not in a room. So it would be, I'm not in a room. So with me, there's 13, but without me, there's 12. And so Pastor Lawrence, if you do not want to be in a room, then you could also configure without you. So that's your choice. I also want to be mindful too of James, who is here. Sometimes it may be important for people of color to be in a separate room to be able to talk about that separate distinction. And so I always make that available. So if you would prefer to do that, then you could separate in that space in that way as well. So that's important to name. So if you want to do that, let's take 10 minutes. And I'd like for you again to think about, because this is important. So that way, if you're in groups of 3, then each person would have about 3 minutes. So I want you to think about how minimization has served you well and how it has failed you. Because there's definitely been some positive, like when we think about that 12 o'clock chart, there are some positive things on that chart. There's some really great, beautiful, healthy things that are on that chart. And so minimization isn't all bad. There's none of these orientations that are all bad. So I want you to think about that and talk about it. And then when we come back together in 10 minutes, well, we'll come back, about 10 minutes, then we'll share. So choose one representative to talk about it so we can talk about so we can share what we've learned. All right, so I'll see you in about 10 minutes. We're back. Welcome back. I'm glad that you had some time to chat in your groups. I sent you away for a little over 10 minutes to consider how minimization has served you well and how it has failed you. I also asked you to choose one person from your group to be a spokesperson to give us a short recap on what you talked about and your processing. So who would like to go first? Look at this. I feel like everybody's putting their finger on their nose. Not me, not me, not me. All right. Mary, who was in your group? Who was a spokesperson from your group, Mary?
Let me unmute myself here. We actually were caught up short. We didn't have a chance to choose a spokesperson and or kind of summarize our thoughts, I'm afraid.
Okay, are you or is someone from your group willing to maybe give a couple of sentences about your discussion?
Sure. I mean, one of the things that we observed is that taking a minimalist approach made things, at least on the surface, sort of easier to deal with. One of the other things that we observed is that it was, if you do take that approach, it's often difficult to know unless an overt conflict develops that you have behaved inappropriately.
Thank you for sharing and for courageously going first. All right, who's up next? There are 4 groups.
I'll go.
All right.
So I'm not the spokesperson, by the way. Same thing. We didn't get a time to identify a spokesperson, but it's Catherine, and us. But kind of in summary, I think we observed that I think that the positive part of it is it allows you to connect with people, right? Having that kind of global perspective allows you to connect with people initially. So to come across those differences you may have, in essence, it's kind of a starting point to then build deeper understanding. And that's all very positive. I think it also, for somebody who's in a better position, or I can't get the Cast book out of my mind right now, so I keep thinking about the words from that. But people who are in a certain position, the positive is minimalization keeps you in that position. But I don't think that's a positive. That's not why we're talking here. I feel like that's also there's a negative to that, which is that people who aren't in that position, minimalization further entrenches them to be where they are. So, but I do think the positive side of it is that it brings that common understanding to everyone, which is really important to then be able to dig deeper and to then, start to make some of those mistakes that you're going to inevitably make.
Right.
So.
I love about what you're saying is we're looking forward to the mistakes. We know that we're going to make them. Mistakes are imminent. And so preparing ourselves for that and naming that really kind of gives us the wiggle room and permission to still move forward courageously, even if we don't get it right. And that's really important. So thank you for sharing. Someone else.
We'll go. So it's just us and then Doug. I guess for benefits, the first thing we talked about is that it keeps minimization, keeps everything just kind of calm. And it's low risk, and you feel like for the person minimizing, you feel like you're not offending anyone, so everything's fine. So there's kind of that viewpoint. And but we did say how it kind of feels like you're sweeping things under the rug, you know, and like kind of just, you know, putting them off. Which all that is very, that what I all just said is like a very like Midwestern Minnesota thing, is just kind of like, you know, not talking about the problem kind of thing. And then I guess the negative would be that like no risk, also like no reward. So, you know, you'll never, like in business or in relationships, if you never take that risk, you'll never learn more and never be able to like reach out more or gain any knowledge about, you know, how you could better interact with this person and how you could, you know, further those relationships. Anything else? Yeah.
That's well said. I love that. No risk, no reward. I love that, right? Again, we're preparing ourselves because this is hard work. This is hard work. So thank you so much for sharing. Last but not least, Pastor Lawrence, we did identify you as a group leader to share some conversations. Do you want to share what we chatted about?
You know, I don't recall that designation, but I will happily take on that role.
I think that James and I remember it very well. We seem to recall that very well.
I see what you did there, but yeah, no, it was for me, I think just processing through the benefits of minimization, and then our conversation for me, what was significant was how it does keep a very surface level of peacefulness, but it doesn't address what might be happening or not happening underneath the surface. And it's kind of going back to, you know, when people say, I don't see race, and how I forget who said it before, but not wanting to say the wrong thing or offend. But for someone hearing, I don't see race, it's interpreted as, I don't see you. I don't see your culture. I don't see what you've been through. I don't see all of the things that make you you. But the person who says it only means, I don't discriminate against people based on the color of their skin. And so it's really trying to work in a space of, you know, and that what was so helpful, and this I didn't say in the group, but that quadrant that you showed us.
Yeah.
That connects back to what we were talking about in the group of different people express things differently. How do you get to a place of communicating and building that bridge across those cultural differences so that shared work and ministry and all of those things happen as it happens. So thank you for that time, Pastor Jia, and thank you all for your questions and comments. This has been very insightful.
It is, and I appreciate that. You know, this feedback session is so important because not only is it understanding where your group has landed, but it's also talking about like giving you tools to begin to look around, survey the landscape, and look around at where there may be some evidence of minimization happening around you, right? And so we're just going to keep on moving. We have a few more things to cover today. This is, if you remember, I told you that there were 4 orientations to talk about. We've only talked about 2. So another one is the orientation gap. And this is the difference along the continuum between the group's perceived orientation, so kind of where you believe you are, and the developmental orientation, where the IDI has placed you based upon the results of your assessment. And so there is a gap. And usually the larger the gap, the more likely the group may misread how effective you are in bridging across cultural differences, right? And so that's really important. So let's talk about this gap. So this is where you have here this gap. It's about, you know, almost 23 points is that gap, right? And that's a significant gap. It's not huge, it's not overwhelming, but it's significant enough to be able to say that where you believe, that there is the tendency or the likelihood that you are misinterpreting or misreading your levels of effectiveness when connecting with people from other cultural backgrounds. And that's something just to be mindful of. So in engaging or in planning or in conversations, to recognize that your intent may not match the impact that you're having. Make sense? Okay. Any questions about that at all? Okay. I can't see you, so Pastor Lawrence will be my wing person in case there's any that people have, and you can always use the chat section as well. Looking ahead at the leading orientation, these are kind of just thinking about these next steps to further development of intercultural competence, right? So because your group's developmental orientation is minimization, then the next leading orientation would be acceptance. And if we just want to circle back to what that acceptance is, which is so important, I want to make sure that we're on the same page of what that looks like. Right? So acceptance is the next grid over. It's the next orientation over. And here is their 12 o'clock chart. So people who land in acceptance in that orientation, starting at 12 o'clock, will be curious about other cultures and interested in learning more about them. The group that lands in orientation of acceptance will recognize that other cultural experiences are just as rich as their own. And they'll be able to suspend judgments of different behaviors and values from other cultures. There'll be a recognition of some differences between one's own culture and other groups. And there will also be the recognition of how one's own actions may be interpreted differently in other cultures. We've talked about that, right? There will also be some developmental opportunities for those landing in acceptance, just like there were for those landing in minimization, right? There could be some ethical or value paralysis. Folks that are landing in acceptance may be uncomfortable making judgments of right and wrong across cultures for fear of being ethnocentric. And there will be a limited capability to more deeply shift cultural perspective and adapt behavior around cultural differences. So again, there's always going to be room for additional development and growing room. There's always going to be blind spots. No matter where we are, there will never be a space on that continuum where even people that are landing in adaptation, for example, there's always going to be things to work on and things to continue to refine. But this is what we're aiming for. And I think it's really important to have this in our conversation so that we're able to see ahead and to see what we're striving for, right? These are the range of developmental orientations that landed from your cohort. You're going to see that the majority of people scored in minimization. But there are probably about 3 people, about 3 people who landed in polarization, right? And there are quite a few, right, who landed in acceptance. So just for you're aware, so this is kind of the range. So we've seen what minimization is, that 12 o'clock chart, and we've talked significantly about that. And we've talked about that acceptance piece, which is really important to know where we're going. It's also important to see the 12 o'clock chart for acceptance so that we can begin to recognize strains of that, patterns and behavior as they come to the surface. And it's also important to recognize when we are hovering over polarization. And so I decided to put this in your chart too, so that we can look at what polarization looks like. So let's start right here. Let's start right at 12 o'clock, right? So people who are letting in polarization may mistrust cultural values and behaviors that differ. They may be aware of some cultural differences, but may have an incomplete understanding of them. Folks who are hovering in polarization on that orientation will view cultural differences potentially as threatening or divisive. And they may have some negative stereotypes, either towards some cultural groups or some positive stereotypes of other groups, depending on which type of polarization that they are hovering over. They may sense that our way or other cultural ways of doing things is superior. There may be some cultural differences that are seen as obstacles to be overcome. And there could be a strong commitment to one's own or to another group's cultural view of the world. Now, I just want to be clear here that people from, regardless of cultural, of ethnic background, can be either in defense or in reverse polarization. So people who may be part of the non-dominant culture could potentially, could be very defensive, could have a very critical view of their own culture and a less critical view of another culture. People who are members of the dominant culture could do the same. They could actually have a more critical view of their own culture and a less critical view of another. So I was talking with someone who landed in polarization and who identified as a member of a dominant dominant culture. And she was part of the reversal. She was definitely very frustrated with her own with her own culture. She felt like, given the climate of this world and of this country, she was very critical. And so we spent a significant amount of time talking. She participated in protests and was very active in the community. And so we talked about the fact that there are some really good things about every single culture. There are positive pieces and segments of every background. And it's important to focus on those, to focus and to lift those up as we're looking at the entire landscape. And so that was kind of her, that was her developmental opportunity, was to begin to become more aware of her own culture, so that we can begin to level that playing field. Why do you think it'd be important for me to show this screen to you? Why would that be important for me to show that to you?
I think it's good to be clear about maybe where you help recognize when you might be going in a direction you don't want to go in, perhaps, or I don't know, those extremes are sometimes helpful because there's gray areas in all of this. Kind of helps you create some borders and bumpers and things that maybe certain actions, things that might become familiar to you that maybe you want to work on. So I don't know, I think it's really helpful to kind of understand the spectrum and where we're trying to go. And part of that is understanding maybe what is on the other side of that spectrum.
Yeah, just go ahead, I'm sorry.
I also wonder whether it's, for me, it's helpful to understand the reversal dimensions of it, that sometimes judgmentalness comes up in ways that we don't even recognize.
Indeed. All right, James, you were going to offer something?
I was just going to piggyback off of what's been said here. You have a concern of overcompensating because of how you felt about your original result. You want to now do more in the opposite direction, and that can also cause you to literally go back in your development, because now you're becoming polarizing, and you don't like your own culture because you want to be more accepting of another culture, and then you're not balanced in that as well.
I think I love that. That's a perspective I hadn't thought of. And I think you're right. I think sometimes us who are, especially here in the United States, who are recovering, some of us are recovering perfectionists and are overachievers. We want to correct, and there's a tendency to want to overcorrect, right? I think that, it's important that we don't look at any of these orientations as negative or as bad. There's no shaming, there's no blaming here. That's not what any of this is about. The focus of this is for us to understand the landscape. Our focus is not just on where we are, but it's about where we're going. It's about our level of effectiveness and understanding where we are and where we'd like to be and how we can get there. And so this is a starting point, and every single person has a starting point. Every person has some space they're starting from, where they're moving from, where they're growing from. And so what a testimony this gives you to have this starting point, wherever that is, so that in a year when we take the IDI again, we're able to look and measure and celebrate our growth. And so every single person starts from someplace. It's important for us to know, to have the range and understand that these three charts are the makeup of the cohort of your group. It's important to be able to recognize when you see patterns of acceptance, patterns of minimization and patterns of polarization. It helps to expand your language and your conversation for you to be able to think about systems that may be put in place, or things not even just in your church, but also in your work or in your home or in your family spaces, which this will help you to begin to recognize those patterns in other spaces. Maybe you turn on the TV and start to recognize that there are some stations that are focusing on minimization. Maybe you find that there are radio stations and conversations that tend to be polarizing. These are things that are designed to begin to get your juices flowing as you're thinking about the ways that these are all entry points that influence the way that we think and view the world, right? And that's really important. I'll give you an example. I told my kids, oh my gosh, you've got to see. So I'm teaching my kids about old school. We have these really big arguments. They believe that the remakes of music are better than the originals. There is no replacing Luther, also known as Luther Vandross. There is no replacing Luther. There's no replacing Whitney. But my children seem to think that Glee, shame it to say, the remakes of Glee are these creators. So we have arguments about Journey and Foreigner and Jefferson Starship. These are arguments we've had. So I was telling them about these shows and I was talking to them. I mean, really, right? Right. Anyway, so I was talking to them. So we have a lot of these things, these conversations at the house where I'll bring out 2 different movies. I'll bring out their 3 Annies and we will watch them. We have this whole series. We'll do Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, all these things. And I was talking to them about Different Strokes. And I was saying to them, this used to be a show I watched all the time. This is good. Like, we should watch this show. So we put on the TV and we're watching the show, something I watched for years growing up. And I was shocked at how upset my children got. I had 2 children who said, I'm not watching this anymore. And I thought, it's not funny. Why are you not watching this? And they said, do you hear all of the racism? Do you hear all of these jokes, these fried chicken jokes and these things that are happening? And the funny thing is that I've been watching it for so long growing up. These are things I hadn't even heard. The same thing with Charles in Charge, this amazing show that we watched. And then to hear that there were impersonations of Asian Americans that were on the show and jokes about people who are about women, I had no idea. But when we're immersed in things and we're so accustomed to hearing it, it becomes an unknown pattern. And we hear these things, and these are entry points that, unbeknownst to us, contribute to the way that we view the world. And sometimes it takes fresh eyes or younger eyes to help us to recognize and realize that there are things that are that are affecting our language and our conversations and our relationships. Now, they are wrong about the originals. There is no replacing Whitney or Jefferson Starship or Foreigner. And this is an argument that will never end because I am right. But they are right about the fact that there are some shows that are here that we used to watch back in those days that definitely in our formative years that have contributed to the way that we connect with other people and the ways that we don't connect with other people. I want to show you something really quickly. Oh, before I do that, I see that we have a couple of, oh, okay. Pastor Lawrence wanted to make sure no one was obsessing about those IDI results. And I will tell you, and I know that a couple of you have reached out to me already, and so we will connect. But if you are interested in your own individual IDI, let's talk about that and let's schedule that. The individual IDIs come not only with the profile, but they come with a development plan, which kind of helps you to process and think through the ways that you view the world. And so I can't give you those results of your own individual IDI ethically without going through them with you. So if you'd like to do that, you can send me an email and we can set up a time. The normal rate for that is about $75 per person, and it's for the hour. All right. So I'm going to go through and I want to show you one more thing before we close. All right. This is a case study that I think is really important. I want you to see. Jenny grew up the daughter of farmers in a small Southwest Minnesota town. She went away to college and fell in love with Elizabeth, a fellow student from Liberia. The first time that Jenny was going to introduce Elizabeth to her parents, Elizabeth ended up being 30 minutes late, and it really irked Jenny's parents. Since then, Jenny has noticed that Elizabeth is often late when they get together. She often has valid excuses. I needed to help a family member who needed a ride, or I ran to someone that I hadn't seen in months. but Jenny cannot help but feel disrespected. What are you noticing about that case study?
Differences in time. And I know I had an experience once where, well, if you start organizing things with outstate Indigenous people, it'll become obvious right away. And it's a difference in values. So, and how you think about time, in terms of why in the world would you expect me to be on time if a relative needs help? Like that's just, you know, and even a friend of mine who was Jamaican said she struggled every time she went back from the States to Jamaica because friends would say, yeah, we'll come by, and then they wouldn't. And so I think having that sense of that different cultures have different ideas about time. And then just as a caveat, I would say, or if Liberian culture isn't more relaxed about time, then it's just you have to, I think you have to weigh both possibilities until you really understand another culture. Absolutely.
There's so many hiccups in just these few sentences, right? Like someone lifted up the fact that Jenny grew up the daughter of farmers, and that's a whole different culture, being on the farm. And I'm seeing nods right there, right? That's a whole different piece. The fact that she's coming from Liberia. And remember, we talked about that. I showed you in the beginning, that whole thing that talked about different cultures, some that are relationship based, right? And some that are task based. The iceberg even talks about the fact that there's a value on relationships and people who are older. And so some of these things, come into play as we're thinking about, what Elizabeth probably feels are valid reasons for not showing up. She may not have the same value in meeting the idea of meeting the parents may not carry the same weight where she is as it does to some of us, right? There could be dynamics about the fact that this is a same gender relationship. There could be, there's so many things that could be at play here where you can see that, that there's a potential for people to completely miss each other, right? And so this is just in these few sentences, we're recognizing that there's so many different dynamics that are beneath that surface of that iceberg that really contribute to helping understand people's value, how they value the world and other people, how they value time. And all of these things are dynamics of culture. And this is where we are, right? This is about getting beneath the surface. And unfortunately, we as a church, meaning capital C, the big church, have really kind of hovered over the surface type, the tip of the iceberg. This is kind of how we have navigated systems. And so as long as we continue to stay transactional, we're going to continue to have transactional relationships. If we're wanting to go deeper and to have deeper relationships, we have to go deeper ourselves. We have to construct frameworks that allow us to go deeper. Otherwise, it is truly that I'm thinking about that definition of insanity, right? Is doing the same thing over and over again, but somehow expecting a different result. We're going to continue to have the same results every time until we change our process and until we change our why. And so if we're wanting to have more diversity, or we're wanting to have more intercultural understanding, if we're wanting to go deeper and build more consistent, sustainable, authentic, mutual relationships, then we've got to go deep. We've got to change the formula. Because the formula we have right now is only existing and working for surface tip of the iceberg relationships. And the action project is designed to do just that, right? So when we're done here, we'll get together in a couple of weeks. We'll get together, it's like about 3 weeks, on November 23rd. Every fourth Monday will be an opportunity for us to get together and for us to gather. So let's talk about that in our last few minutes. Let's talk about what's coming next. All right. So the first thing I want you to do is I want you to get a journal. I don't care what kind of journal you get. It could be a dollar store journal. It could be a fancy Target brand journal. It could be a digital journal that maybe you're not a writer. Maybe your pen doesn't do it for you and you want to put it on your computer. Whatever it is you want to do, I'd like you to get a journal. This is a way for you to begin to document, for you to kind of your journey, what's happening over the year, for you to be able to kind of have a holding space, a container for your thoughts and your questions and your reflections and your wonderings. Get a journal before November 23rd. In the next couple of weeks, probably a week before November 23rd, I'm going to set you up with an action buddy. This is going to be someone that you may know them, but someone that's not in your faith community. This will be someone that you can connect with at a time that works good for you, in a way that works good for you, that's comfortable and safe for you. Maybe you do virtual coffee once a week or once a month. Maybe you just send emails back and forth and share ideas. Maybe you have a phone call. Whatever it is you do, that's up to you. But someone that you can work through your processes with, fine, you'll have an action buddy. And it'll be up to you and your buddy to create, maintain, sustain that relationship. I'm going to get together. We'll be gathering with you. I'll send you some information about a week before November 23rd, which will have a link, connection link for us to have these monthly gatherings. I'm calling them Community Action. All 7 congregations are going to come together on this date from 7 to 9 p.m. I just haven't decided the platform yet. So from 7 to 8:30 will be a 90-minute type of a workshop, where we will have time that'll be guided by a variety of different local community educators that will walk us through different perspectives. And then we'll have 30 minutes of random small groups for us to have our own conversations. So I want you to see what that looks like. Oh, I have to stop sharing before I can open that. Hold on just one second. Okay. Open up for me. Okay. So let me reshare my screen. All right. So this here, if it will let me up here to make it bigger. And it's not. Oh, here it is. Okay. So this is kind of what the program is going to look like. You already took your IDI assessment and you're going to take it again in a year. The 12 months in between, I'm breaking into 3 4-month time blocks. The first one is all about history. How did we get here? The second one is life and faith through the lenses of the marginalized. And the third 4-month is all about solidarity as defined by those on the margins. Solidarity is a word that's often overused and underutilized, just like culture. So I want to make sure that we understand when we say that we're an ally or we're standing in solidarity, we're just like that platinum rule. We're doing solidarity as it is effective and meaningful to others versus the way that we define it. You'll see here that I've broken this up into 4 different groups. So there is an Indigenous lens, and that will be every month, or that'll be every segment. In the history piece, they are rotating. Indigenous and African American lens will be what we're focusing on as it relates to history, how we got here, learning about the history. Life and faith will involve a Latinx lens, Asian American and Pacific Islander lens, and solidarity will offer those as well. I'm excited to have Jim Bear Jacobs and his team as guiding us through the Indigenous piece. Reverend Dwayne Davis guiding us through the African American lens. Christian Briones will be guiding us through the Latinx lens. And there are a couple of people that are probably going to work together to guide us through the Asian American Pacific Islander lens. We'll be leaning on them. They'll be guiding us, and I'll be learning right along with you. They'll provide 90 minutes of workshop and education and 30 minutes of random small groups with guided prompts. In addition to the community action that's on a monthly piece, starting right after November 23rd, I'll be sending you weekly invitations. And actually, I'll be sending them through Pastor Lawrence. There'll be weekly invitations, which will have invitations for you to connect with a local community ministry that is focusing on that relationship base that we talked about, right? There'll be opportunities for you to have videos and books and articles that will expand our conversations, not just around these 4 groups, but also the LGBTQ community, also through people that are living with disabilities, people who are elderly, the experiences of women. There'll be a variety of infusions of experiences and stories. I'm so excited because I've been interviewing and videotaping people who have a tremendous amount of stories that you'll be able to hear as well. So there'll be a whole hodgepodge, a menu of ways for you to get together, for you to get involved. Some congregations have their own meeting spaces and holding spaces. I know we talked about this the last time. So there'll be opportunities for people to meet. People of color will have a separate, will also have another group for them to be able to meet and to connect and converse as well in a way that feels safe and healthy for them. So here's this menu. And then we'll come back together again and take the IDI again a year from this month in October. And I can't wait. Any questions that you have for me before we close? Yes.
Sorry, on those monthly meetings, are they always going to be Monday about 7, or is that still to be determined?
Always the fourth Monday at 7.
Okay. Is it fine to jump in a little bit late? Or if you can't be there right at 7? Okay.
Yep, you could do that. And what we'll do is we will, those will be recorded and they'll be shared. So I'll send those to the clergy. So Pastor Lawrence will have that recording and he'll be able to share that with people. Now, just a note, these are not recordings that are for the entire community. These are notes that are part of the journey for the people that are part of the Action Project. And that's really important because we're all together kind of making this covenant, this commitment that we're going to journey together. And I'm hopeful that people who are interested in taking this journey will also take this journey complete with the IDI going forward as well. Other questions that people have? Okay, if nothing else, let me know if you would like an individual IDI. Look for information from me about an action buddy in a couple of weeks, kind of putting people together, and get a journal, get a journal, get a journal, right? Thanks so much for your time, for spending your time on this Saturday. I don't know how long this good weather is going to last. So it is definitely a gift that you have selected to use 2 of your glorious sunny hours to spend with me. So thank you so much for doing that. And thank you, Pastor Lawrence, for your leadership.
Well, thank you all so much. I appreciate each of you. Take care. I know y'all excited to get off, so I'll just say goodbye and I'll be sending you an email with all of this information coming soon. Take care, everyone.